I kept my brother's last voicemail for 367 days. Every time I saw that red notification on my phone, my stomach would twist into knots. 3 minutes and 42 seconds of his voice, just sitting there, waiting. I told myself I wasn't ready. I told myself I needed more time. But the truth? I was terrified of what Danny might have said in those final moments before he made his choice. When I finally pressed play, sitting in my car outside Chicago General after another exhausting 12-hour shift, I expected to hear goodbye. I expected to hear sorry. I expected to hear all the things people say when they're about to leave this world forever. What I didn't expect was a confession that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. Tessa, it's me. I know you're probably at work, saving lives like you always do. God, I wish I could be more like you. I wish I could fix things instead of breaking them. His voice was shaky, different from the Danny I knew. I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you 2 years ago. Something Mom and Dad made me promise to never say out loud. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, my hands already trembling. Remember the Henderson kid? Little Emma? The one who got hit by that car on Maple Street? The one who... His voice cracked. Tessa, it was me. I was the one driving. I was high, I was scared, and I ran. I left that little girl lying in the street, and I drove home like nothing happened. The world stopped spinning. Right there in the hospital parking lot, surrounded by the familiar sounds of sirens and city traffic, everything went silent. Emma Henderson. I remembered her. 7 years old, bright red hair, always riding her bike around the neighborhood. The whole community had mourned her loss. Her parents had begged for answers, for justice, for anything that might help them understand why their daughter was taken from them. And my brother, my gentle, troubled brother who wouldn't hurt a fly, he was the one who took her away. Mom and Dad know, Danny continued, his words coming faster now, more desperate. They found out when I came home that night, covered in blood and crying. They said we had to protect me, that I was too fragile, that the truth would destroy me completely. They made me promise to never tell anyone, not even you. They said it would ruin our family, ruin everything we'd worked for. I thought about my parents then. My successful surgeon father and my real estate mogul mother, always so concerned about appearances, about what the neighbors might think. Always so protective of Danny, their sensitive son who'd struggled with depression and anxiety since he was 12. They'd wrapped him in bubble wrap his entire life, making excuses for his behavior, cleaning up his messes, never letting him face the real consequences of his actions. But this was different. This wasn't a broken window or a failed grade. This was a little girl's life. I can't live with it anymore, Tessa. I see her face every time I close my eyes. I hear her mother crying at the grocery store, talking to Mrs. Peterson about how she still sets Emma's place at the dinner table. I drive past their house, and I see her father sitting on the porch, just staring at the street where it happened. They deserve to know the truth. They deserve justice. But I'm too much of a coward to give it to them. The voicemail kept playing, but I could barely hear it over the sound of my own heartbeat. 3 years. For 3 years, I'd watched the Henderson family grieve, watched them struggle with unanswered questions, watched them slowly fall apart. Mrs. Henderson had quit her job at the bank, unable to focus on anything but her lost daughter. Mr. Henderson had started drinking, showing up to neighborhood barbecues with hollow eyes and shaking hands. And all this time, my family knew. My parents knew. They'd chosen to protect their son over giving a grieving family the closure they desperately needed. I'm sorry, Tessa. I'm sorry for what I did, and I'm sorry for what I'm about to do. But I can't carry this anymore. I can't pretend to be okay when I'm not. I can't keep living in a house built on lies. Maybe when I'm gone, you'll find a way to make this right. Maybe you'll be brave enough to do what I couldn't. The voicemail ended with a click, leaving me sitting in stunned silence. Around me, life continued as normal. Doctors and nurses walked past my car, heading home after their shifts. Patients' families hurried through the parking lot, carrying flowers and get-well cards. The world kept spinning, but I felt like I was frozen in time, trapped in that moment when everything I thought I knew about my family crumbled to dust. I'd always wondered why Danny had chosen that particular Tuesday to end his life. He'd seemed better in the weeks leading up to it, more stable, almost peaceful. Now I understood. He'd finally made his decision. He'd chosen death over truth, silence over justice. And he'd left me holding the pieces of a secret that could destroy everything. That night, I drove to my parents' house for the first time since Danny's funeral. They lived in the same pristine suburban home where we'd grown up, where family portraits lined the hallways and trophies from our childhood achievements gathered dust on the mantelpiece. Everything looked exactly the same, but I saw it differently now. I saw the cracks in the facade, the careful staging, the desperate need to maintain appearances at any cost. Mom answered the door in her silk robe, her face immediately lighting up with that practiced smile she'd perfected over the years. "Tessa. What a wonderful surprise. Come in, come in. Your father's in his study, reviewing surgical notes. Let me get you some tea." I followed her into the kitchen, watching as she moved with the same graceful efficiency she'd always possessed. Everything about her was controlled, measured, perfect. Even her grief over losing Danny had been carefully contained, expressed only in socially acceptable ways. Private tears, tasteful memorial donations, elegant sympathy cards thanked and filed away. I listened to Danny's voicemail, I said without preamble. Her hand stilled on the tea kettle. For just a moment, her perfectly composed mask slipped, and I saw something raw and terrified flash across her face. Then it was gone, replaced by that familiar look of maternal concern. "Oh, sweetheart. I know how hard it must be, hearing his voice again. But you know how he was in those final weeks. The depression, the medications, the confusion. He wasn't thinking clearly. He said all sorts of things that weren't." "Emma Henderson," I interrupted. The tea kettle slipped from her hands, clattering against the granite countertop. Water splashed across the floor, but she didn't move to clean it up. She just stood there, staring at me with the look of someone who'd been caught in a lie they'd spent years perfecting. "You know," I continued, my voice steadier than I felt. "You've known this whole time. 3 years, Mom. 3 years you've watched that family suffer, and you said nothing." Dad appeared in the doorway then, still wearing his scrubs from the hospital. He must have heard the commotion, or maybe he'd been listening from the beginning. His face was grave, tired in a way that had nothing to do with his demanding schedule. "Tessa," he said quietly. "Sit down. Let us explain." "Explain what?" "How you covered up a hit and run? How you let a grieving family wonder why their daughter died? How you chose to protect your son over doing what was right?" "We chose to protect our family," Mom said sharply, some of her composure returning. Danny was 17 years old. He was already struggling with his mental health. If the truth had come out, it would have ruined his life. He would have gone to prison, and for what? Emma was already gone. Nothing we could do would bring her back. "But something you could have done might have saved him," I shot back. "Maybe if he'd faced the consequences of his actions, if he'd gotten real help instead of being protected from reality, he'd still be alive." Dad flinched as if I'd slapped him. "You think we don't know that? You think we don't replay that night over and over again, wondering if we made the right choice? We were trying to save our son. And instead you lost him anyway," I said more softly. "You lost him, and you let another family continue to suffer unnecessarily." The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of water still dripping from the overturned kettle. I looked at my parents, these people I'd loved and respected my entire life, and saw them clearly for the first time. They weren't monsters. They were just people who'd made a terrible choice out of love and fear, and that choice had poisoned everything it touched. "The Henderson family deserves to know the truth," I said finally. "Absolutely not," Mom said immediately. "Tessa, you cannot tell them. Think about what that would do to our family. Think about your father's practice, my business, your own career. This kind of scandal would destroy everything we've built. Maybe it should, I said. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Emma Henderson, about the little girl I'd seen riding her bike around the neighborhood, always wearing that bright yellow helmet her mother had insisted on. I thought about Danny, about the weight he'd carried for 3 years, about how that weight had ultimately crushed him. And I thought about the Henderson family, about parents who'd lost their daughter and never got the answers they needed to begin healing. I found myself driving through our old neighborhood at 2 in the morning, past the elementary school where Emma would have been starting 4th grade, past the park where she used to play on the swings. I stopped at the corner of Maple Street, at the exact spot where it happened. Someone had placed a small memorial there, a wooden cross with plastic flowers that had faded in the sun. A small plaque read, "In memory of Emma Henderson, taken too soon." I sat in my car, staring at that memorial, and I made my decision. Finding Maria Henderson wasn't difficult. She still lived in the same house, still worked part-time at the library downtown. I'd seen her there occasionally over the years, always looking a little lost, a little broken. She'd aged dramatically since Emma's death, her dark hair now streaked with premature gray, her eyes hollow with grief that had nowhere to go. I waited until she was alone, shelving books in the children's section. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were surrounded by picture books and fairy tales, stories where good always triumphed over evil, where justice always prevailed in the end. "Mrs. Henderson?" I said softly. She looked up, and I saw the momentary confusion in her eyes as she tried to place me. "Yes? I'm Tessa Morgan. I used to live in your neighborhood. I knew Emma." Her face immediately softened, the way it always did when someone mentioned her daughter. "Oh, yes. You're the nurse, aren't you? Your mother mentioned you work at General." I nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to speak. How do you tell a grieving mother that you've been living with the truth about her daughter's death for 3 years? How do you explain that your family chose silence over justice? "Mrs. Henderson, I need to tell you something about Emma's accident. About what really happened that night." The color drained from her face. She gripped the edge of the bookshelf, her knuckles white against the wood. "Did they find him? Did they find the person who?" "It was my brother," I said simply. "Danny Morgan. He was the one driving the car that night." I watched her face cycle through a dozen emotions in the space of seconds. Shock, disbelief, anger, confusion, and finally, something that might have been relief. She sank into one of the small chairs meant for children, and I knelt beside her, feeling like I was confessing to a priest. "He was 17, I continued. He was high, and scared, and he made a terrible choice to run. My parents found out that night, and they decided to protect him. They thought it would destroy him if the truth came out." 3 years, she whispered. For 3 years, I've wondered. I've imagined 100 different scenarios, created a dozen different faces for the person who took my daughter and drove away. I've hated strangers on the street, suspected neighbors, wondered if I'd ever feel safe again. "I'm so sorry," I said, and the words felt inadequate, pathetic in the face of her pain. "I didn't know until last week. Danny left me a voicemail before he died. He couldn't live with the secret anymore." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something unexpected in her eyes. Not hatred, not anger, but something softer. Something that looked almost like understanding. "He took his own life," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to speak around the lump in my throat. "The guilt," she continued. "It ate him alive, didn't it?" "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the children's books that surrounded us. Stories of adventure and magic, of problems that could be solved in 30 pages or less. Finally, she spoke again. "I used to fantasize about finding the person who killed Emma. I'd imagine confronting them, making them pay for what they did. I wanted them to suffer the way I was suffering." "But your brother, he was just a child himself, wasn't he? A scared, sick child who made a terrible mistake." That doesn't excuse what he did, I said. And it doesn't excuse my parents' choice to cover it up. No, she agreed. It doesn't. But it helps me understand. And understanding, that's something I haven't had in a very long time. We sat together in that children's section for what felt like hours, surrounded by stories with happy endings, talking about the messy, complicated reality of grief and forgiveness. Maria told me about Emma, about the little girl who'd loved butterflies and chocolate chip cookies, who'd wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. I told her about Danny, about my gentle brother who'd been too sensitive for this world, who'd carried everyone's pain as if it were his own. I don't forgive him, she said finally. I can't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I understand now why he couldn't live with what he'd done. And I'm grateful that someone finally told me the truth. What will you do now? I asked. She considered the question carefully. I think I'll tell my husband. He deserves to know. We've been falling apart for 3 years, each of us drowning in our own grief, unable to help each other because we had no answers. Maybe now we can start to heal together. And my parents? Her expression hardened slightly. That's not for me to decide. But Tessa, they need to face the consequences of their choice. Emma deserved better than to be forgotten, to be covered up, to be treated like a shameful secret. I knew she was right. I'd known it from the moment I'd heard Danny's voicemail. But knowing and doing are two very different things, especially when it comes to family. The confrontation with my parents was everything I'd expected and worse. They accused me of betraying the family, of destroying Danny's memory, of being selfish and cruel. Mom threatened to disown me. Dad warned me about the legal implications, the potential charges for obstruction of justice, the media attention that would follow. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care about their approval. I didn't care about maintaining the family image or protecting our reputation. I cared about truth, about justice, about the little girl who deserved so much better than to be forgotten. The legal process was complicated. Because Danny was dead, there could be no criminal charges against him. But my parents faced potential charges for obstruction of justice, for interfering with a police investigation. In the end, they received community service and probation, a slap on the wrist that felt insufficient but was better than nothing. The real consequences came from within our community. The story made local news, and suddenly everyone knew. Dad's surgical practice suffered as patients found new doctors. Mom's real estate business lost clients who could no longer trust her integrity. Social invitations dried up, and longtime friends crossed the street to avoid uncomfortable conversations. They blamed me for all of it, of course. In their minds, I'd destroyed our family over a mistake that couldn't be undone. They couldn't understand that the family had been destroyed long before I spoke the truth. It had been destroyed the night they chose to protect their son over seeking justice for a murdered child. But something unexpected happened in the aftermath. The Henderson family, rather than pursuing revenge or demanding blood, chose a different path. They established a foundation in Emma's name, focused on child safety and mental health awareness. They asked me to serve on the board. We can't bring Emma back, Maria told me at our first meeting. But we can try to prevent other families from going through what we've experienced. And we can work to destigmatize mental health treatment, so that other young people like your brother get the help they need before it's too late. Working with the Henderson family was strange at first. There were moments of awkwardness, flashes of pain, uncomfortable silences that stretched too long. But gradually, something beautiful began to emerge from all that grief and guilt. We found purpose in our shared loss, meaning in our mutual commitment to creating something positive from tragedy. I started speaking at high schools about mental health, about the importance of seeking help, about the devastating consequences of untreated depression and anxiety. I talked about Danny, about the brother I'd loved and lost, about how his silence had ultimately killed him. I talked about the importance of truth, even when it's painful, even when it threatens everything you think you care about. The first time I spoke at Lincoln High, Danny's old school, I was terrified. I stood behind the podium, looking out at a sea of teenage faces, and saw my brother in every one of them. These kids, with their whole lives ahead of them, deserving to know that they mattered, that their struggles were real, that help was available if they were brave enough to ask for it. My brother Danny was 17 when he made a choice that would define the rest of his short life, I began. He was high, he was scared, and he was driving a car when he shouldn't have been. In a moment of panic, he made a decision that took an innocent life and set him on a path toward his own destruction. I told them about the accident, about the cover-up, about the 3 years of guilt that had eaten Danny alive from the inside. I talked about mental health stigma, about the way society treats depression and anxiety as character flaws rather than medical conditions. I talked about the importance of seeking help, of telling the truth, of facing consequences rather than running from them. I'm not here to tell you that my brother was a monster, I said. He wasn't. He was a sick kid who needed help and didn't get it. He was a young man who made a terrible mistake and was too afraid to face the consequences. He was my little brother, and I loved him, but love wasn't enough to save him from himself. After the presentation, a girl approached me. She was maybe 16, with Danny's same sensitive eyes and nervous energy. She told me she'd been struggling with depression, that she'd been having thoughts about ending her life, that she'd been too scared to tell anyone because she didn't want to be seen as weak or crazy. But after hearing about your brother, she said, I think I want to try getting help. I don't want to end up like him, carrying secrets that are too heavy to bear. I gave her the number for a counselor I trusted, watched as she carefully wrote it down in her phone. As she walked away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, hope. The foundation grew slowly but steadily. We organized support groups for families dealing with mental health crises, funded counseling services for low-income students, and advocated for better mental health resources in schools. We partnered with local hospitals to provide training for emergency room staff on recognizing and responding to mental health emergencies. Every program we created, every life we touched, felt like a small redemption. Not enough to bring back Emma or Danny, but enough to honor their memories in a meaningful way. My relationship with my parents remained strained. We spoke occasionally, usually about practical matters or family obligations. They'd softened somewhat over time, the anger giving way to a weary resignation. I think they'd finally begun to understand that I hadn't acted out of spite or cruelty, but out of a deep need to do what was right. Mom called me on the 2nd anniversary of Danny's death. She'd been visiting his grave, she said, and had run into Maria Henderson there. They'd talked for a few minutes, two mothers united by loss, sharing stories about their children. She told me about the foundation, Mom said. About the work you're doing together. She said Danny would be proud of what you've accomplished. I was surprised by how much those words meant to me, coming from the woman who'd lost her daughter because of my brother's actions. Maybe, I said. I hope so. I'm proud of you too, Mom said quietly. I may not have understood your choice at the time, but I see now that you did what Danny couldn't. You told the truth, even when it cost you everything. That conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. We began to heal, slowly and carefully, building something new from the wreckage of our family's destruction. It would never be the same as it was before, but perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. The old version of our family had been built on secrets and lies, on protecting appearances over pursuing truth. This new version, fragile as it was, had honesty as its foundation. 5 years after Danny's death, the Emma Henderson Foundation hosted its first annual mental health awareness run. Hundreds of people gathered in Lincoln Park, wearing yellow t-shirts in Emma's honor, running not just for physical fitness but for the mental health resources that could save lives. I stood at the starting line, surrounded by families who'd been touched by suicide, by young people who'd found the courage to seek help, by community members who'd chosen to support rather than stigmatize mental health treatment. Maria Henderson stood beside me, wearing her daughter's bright yellow helmet, carrying a photo of Emma that she'd laminated and attached to her running bib. "Ready?" she asked, and I nodded. The starting gun fired, and we began to run. Not away from our grief, not from our guilt, not from the painful truths that had brought us together. We ran toward something better, toward a future where other families might be spared the losses we'd endured. As we rounded the first corner, I thought about Danny's voicemail, about those 3 minutes and 42 seconds that had changed everything. I'd been so afraid to listen to his final words, terrified of what truths they might contain. But sometimes the most painful truths are also the most necessary ones. Sometimes the things that break us are the very things that teach us how to heal. The run ended back at the park, where families gathered for a picnic and resource fair. I watched children play on the same swings where Emma had once laughed, saw teenagers talking to counselors about depression and anxiety, observed parents learning about warning signs and treatment options. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to balance the scales of what we'd lost. But it was something. It was hope made tangible, grief transformed into purpose, silence replaced by truth. Later that evening, as I was packing up the foundation's materials, Maria approached me. She was holding a small yellow envelope, worn soft from years of handling. "I wanted to give you this," she said. "It's a letter Emma wrote to her future self when she was 6 years old. Her teacher had the class write them as a time capsule project, and we found it in her backpack after she died." I opened the envelope carefully, as if it contained something precious and fragile. Which, I suppose, it did. Emma's handwriting was crooked and uneven, the spelling creative, the message pure and hopeful in the way that only children can be. "Dear future Emma," it read. "I hope you are still happy and nice. I hope you help people when they are sad. I hope you remember to be kind even when other people are not kind to you. I hope you make the world better. Love, Emma, age 6. I looked up at Maria, tears blurring my vision. "She wanted to help people who were sad," I whispered. "Yes," Maria said. "And through you, through the foundation, through all the work we're doing, she is. She's helping people, just like she wanted to." I thought about that letter often in the weeks that followed. Emma's simple wish to make the world better, to help people who were sad, had become a reality in ways she never could have imagined. Her death, tragic and senseless as it was, had ultimately led to something meaningful. Not redemption, exactly, but purpose. Not healing, but hope. The foundation continued to grow. We opened a counseling center in Emma's name, staffed by therapists who specialized in adolescent mental health. We created a scholarship program for students pursuing degrees in psychology and social work. We lobbied for better mental health education in schools, for earlier intervention programs, for reduced stigma around seeking treatment. Each success felt like a small victory, not just for the foundation but for Emma and Danny both. 2 children who died too young, one from violence and one from his own hand, but whose stories were now helping to save others. I still have Danny's voicemail on my phone. I've listened to it hundreds of times now, and each time I hear something new in his voice. Fear, yes, and guilt and desperation. But also love. Love for me, for the truth, for the family we'd lost when secrets took precedence over honesty. Sometimes people ask me if I regret my decision to reveal the truth about Emma's death. They want to know if I think the cost was worth it, if I believe justice was served, if I found peace in the aftermath of my family's destruction. The answer is complicated. I regret the pain my decision caused, the relationships it damaged, the innocence it shattered. I regret that it took Danny's death for the truth to come out, that he carried that burden alone for so long. I regret that Emma's parents had to wait 3 years for answers, 3 years of wondering and grieving without understanding. But I don't regret telling the truth. Because the truth, painful as it was, freed all of us from the lies that were slowly poisoning our lives. It gave the Henderson family the closure they needed to begin healing. It allowed Danny's story to serve a purpose beyond his own tragic end. And it taught me that love without honesty is not really love at all. In the end, that's what I learned from Danny's last voicemail. That secrets are heavier than we imagine, that silence can be more destructive than truth, and that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to speak the words that no one wants to hear. The foundation is planning its 10th anniversary celebration next year. We're hoping to open a second counseling center, to expand our school programs, to reach even more families who are struggling with mental health challenges. Maria Henderson, now in her 50s, has become one of my closest friends. We talk regularly about our children, about grief, about the strange paths that led us to each other. Do you think they would be proud of us? She asked me recently as we reviewed applications for our scholarship program. I thought about Emma, the 6-year-old who'd wanted to help sad people. I thought about Danny, who'd carried the weight of his actions until it crushed him. I thought about all the young people we'd helped over the years, all the families we'd supported, all the conversations we'd started about mental health and truth and forgiveness. Yes, I said. I think they would be. As I write this, sitting in my apartment on the anniversary of Danny's death, I can see the Emma Henderson Memorial Counseling Center from my window. It's a small building, painted yellow like Emma's favorite helmet, with a garden full of butterflies that she would have loved. Tonight, the lights are still on because our crisis counselors work around the clock, ready to help anyone who needs support. The phone rings occasionally, and I know that somewhere in the city, someone is making the call that Danny never could. Someone is choosing to reach out rather than suffer in silence. Someone is deciding that their life is worth fighting for, that their pain is worth sharing, that their truth is worth telling. Those calls, those choices, those moments of courage, they're Danny's real legacy. Not the accident, not the cover-up, not the suicide that ended his pain. His legacy is in every person who finds the strength to ask for help, every family that chooses honesty over appearances, every community that decides to treat mental illness as a medical condition rather than a moral failing. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never listened to that voicemail. If I'd deleted it, moved on, allowed my family's secret to die with Danny. We'd still be living a lie, but it would be a comfortable lie, one that protected us from painful truths and difficult conversations. But Emma's parents would still be wondering. Other families would still be struggling in silence. And Danny's death would have been truly meaningless, just another tragic suicide with no greater purpose. Instead, his voice continues to echo through the work we do, through the lives we touch, through the conversations we start about mental health and responsibility and the courage it takes to tell the truth. His last words, spoken into a phone on the worst night of his life, have become a catalyst for healing that reaches far beyond our small corner of Chicago. That's not redemption. That's not enough to balance the scales of what was lost. But it's something. It's hope. It's progress. It's proof that even our darkest moments can become the foundation for something better. And sometimes, when I'm feeling overwhelmed by the weight of all we've lost and all we're trying to build, I remember Emma's letter. Her simple wish to help sad people, to make the world better, to be kind even when others are not kind to you. She was 6 years old when she wrote those words, but she understood something that took me years to learn. That healing doesn't come from hiding our pain, but from transforming it into purpose. That the most powerful way to honor those we've lost is to use their stories to help others. That love, real love, requires us to tell the truth even when it hurts. If you're listening to this and struggling with your own secrets, your own guilt, your own mental health challenges, please know that you're not alone. There are people who want to help, resources available, conversations waiting to happen. The call you're afraid to make, the truth you're afraid to tell, the help you're afraid to seek, it's all there, waiting for you to find the courage to reach out. Don't let silence become your prison. Don't let secrets become your burden. Don't let fear become your fate. Your story matters. Your truth matters. Your life matters. And sometimes, the most loving thing we can do is to speak the words that no one wants to hear. Subscribe if this story touched you, and share your own experiences in the comments below.